No, it hadn't started yet, but it is starting now. But they won't know who, so no big deal. All right, so we're going to go over the skeletal system now. So this includes two chapters currently. And if you all are using it, it's chapter 7 and 8. So 7 and 8 are over the skeletal system. The first goes into the skeletal tissue, and the other a little bit more about the individual bones and the purpose of those bones. So we'll get into that a little bit later in the lecture. But first, let's start by just doing a recap. Some of this you all saw in the tissues chapter. First, the skeletal system is composed of bones, joints, cartilage, and ligaments. So you should know those structures are part of the skeletal system. Bones, joints, cartilage, and ligaments. And so we talked about in the tissue chapter, one of the main functions of bone, which is what support, right? Support and protection. And so they're able to support and protect because of their strong, flexible framework. And also you have cartilage, which is, I mentioned in the tissues chapter, that a child is developing in utero, that they start off not with bone, but with cartilage. And what type of cartilage is that? Remember what type of cartilage is found in make up fetal bones? Hyaline cartilage, good. So hyaline cartilage has to be converted to bones at some point. So cartilage, so what this means here is cartilage is the forerunner of most bones. It's there before the bones actually occur. And we'll see there's a term for that. Whenever cartilage turns into bone, there is a term for that we'll talk about in just a second. All right, covers many joint surfaces of mature bones. So cartilage, as we talked about before, you all remember the three types of cartilage? Elastic, hyaline, and fibrocartilage. So you remember where those are located in the body? Remember that there is certain types of cartilage that covers the ends of long bones. Remember that? We'll talk about long bones in a moment. So we'll get into the locations of that cartilage that we spoke of before. And also we mentioned ligaments and tendons. And the function of ligaments is to what? Connect bone to bone, and tendons, muscle to bone. Good. So make sure you all remember that. I'm sure that will come back up on the next test. All right. Let's see. So functions again: support, hold the body up. So as I asked before, what would we look at like if we didn't have bones? How would we look differently? How would we look different? We wouldn't be upright, right? We kind of just be a blob. So support, I would say, is probably the main function. Protection, how does the skeleton protect us? What is it protecting specifically? Right. So if you think of where some of your most vital organs are, they're protected by the skeleton. The brain is protected. Imagine if we didn't have a skull, how difficult that would be. Every time we bumped our head, we have the potential of dying just from bumping our head. So the skeleton, the brain is protected by the skull. The spinal cord is protected by the vertebrae. The heart, what protects the heart? The sternum, for one, right, and also the ribs in the area. And the lungs, what protects the lungs? The ribs, very good. So the skeleton also provides movement. Not in the same way that we say muscles do. So muscles, we know muscles are specifically specialized to be able to what? Contract. So that means whatever a muscle is connected to, when it contracts, it's going to pull on whatever it's connected to. So the skeletal muscles are called skeletal muscles because they're connected mostly to what? To our skeleton, to the bones. So those contractions cause the movement of our bones and therefore our limbs. Okay? Also breathing actions of muscle on bone. So we also have the skeleton, which provides electrolyte balance, particularly calcium and phosphate, those electrolytes. So you do need to know that bone, the skeleton, is considered to be a reservoir of calcium. So it stores calcium. And we're going to talk a lot about calcium. And just like we talked about blood glucose, remember why we have glucose in the blood? And why it has to be maintained, why it can't be too high or too low. There'll be problems with it if we have too much calcium or too little calcium in the blood as well. And that's where we get into the calcium homeostasis. So there's also an important function in maintaining acid-base balance and also formation of blood. So we'll see a little bit more of those as we go through this chapter and then in later chapters as well. All right, so what are some cells we've talked about before? We actually mentioned these two already, right? Osteoblasts and osteocytes. So remember the relationship between those two? What's the relationship? Good memory. So remember, osteoblasts are immature bone cells. So they're both cells. Okay, all of these are cells. But what do osteoblasts have to do to become an osteocyte? So osteoblasts, remember, are immature cells. Osteocytes are mature cells. So they're the same cell, it's just that they develop. It's like you're a child, but then you're an adult. So you're the same person, it's just that you developed into the adult that you became. So in order for an osteoblast to become an osteocyte, what has to happen? Good memories. Right, so the osteoblast, so here's a key. Remember that the osteoblasts have an important job, and that is to make the matrix. Right? What is the matrix? What's the matrix of any tissue? Right, so the material outside of the cell is what makes up a tissue's matrix. So bone, being a tissue, is going to have cells. These are the cells, but the material outside of the cells has to be manufactured, and it is manufactured by bone. Okay? So that is why osteoblasts are called bone-forming cells. They form the matrix, which makes up the predominant part of our bones. All right? So then you have, once the osteoblasts are producing the matrix, they become trapped in that matrix that they make. So once they become trapped, then they are referred to as mature cells or osteocytes. Okay? So the osteocytes, their main job is to maintain and repair the existing bone matrix. Okay? So they're the mature cells. So let's go back a step. So before there are osteoblasts, there are osteogenic cells. So osteogenic cells are the stem cells that actually give rise to osteoblasts. Have we talked any about stem cells? So stem cells are cells that are unspecialized. So we talked about what happens when an egg is fertilized by a sperm. What does that produce? One cell called a what? Zygote. Very good. So that one zygote ends up making all of our cells. But initially, all of those cells are identical to each other. But eventually you end up with osteocytes, you end up with chondrocytes, you end up with skin cells, you end up with heart cells. So what is it that tells those cells, okay, you're not going to be like all of your other cells. You're going to go to do something special, specific. Well, all the cells have the same DNA. That's another important point. But there's a point during the development process where the cells are instructed to specialize. So they're called stem cells when they are unspecialized. Yeah, that process of cells becoming specialized is called differentiation. Differentiation. Okay? So the osteogenic cells give rise to the osteoblasts, which mature to become osteocytes. So those are within the same cell line. Osteoclasts are different. They're not in the same lineage. The main thing about osteoclasts that you need to know is that their job is to break down bone. So they break down bone matrix. And that breakdown is also referred to as resorption. So you'll see throughout the textbook bone resorption. You just need to know that that means breaking down bone. Okay, so in the test I kind of use osteoblast and osteoclast a lot. So you kind of know that they kind of have an opposite role, right? Osteoblast's job is to what? Form bone or make bone, whereas osteoclast's job is to break down bone. Okay? All right, so I think it's kind of clear why bones have to be formed, and this actually continues throughout life. There's something called bone remodeling, which we'll get into, probably coming up here shortly. Yeah, let's hold off on that. But we'll get back to the osteoblast and osteoclast. So again, bone is a connective tissue, and one of the characteristics of connective tissues is that there's more space between cells, right? So most of the tissue is matrix rather than cells. But there's a wide variety of different types of connective tissues in type and also in composition. So if you compare bone tissue to that of blood, which is another connective tissue, look at the extreme difference in the tissues themselves. One is a hard tissue, the other one is fluid tissue. So blood is a fluid, but it's still connective tissue. So what is it that makes them different? Yeah, they're made up of cells, but what's different between them is what? The matrix, right? So the reason blood is a fluid is because its matrix is a fluid. Remember the matrix of blood? Plasma. So plasma is the matrix of blood. Okay? Whereas bone is not a fluid because its matrix is made up of calcium phosphate, which is hard. Okay? So the connective tissue with the matrix that is hardened by calcium phosphate as well as other minerals. Be familiar with these two terms, mineralization and calcification. And that just means the process of hardening bone. Okay? Mineralization or calcification, hardening process of bone. Individual bones consist of bone tissue, also bone marrow, which we'll talk about a little bit later, cartilage, fat tissue, adipose tissue, nervous tissue, and fibrous connective tissue. So all of those make up individual bones, as we'll see in a second. And another key point is that our bones continually remodel throughout life. Our bones continually remodel throughout life, and permeated with nerves and blood vessels. So we'll see in a second when you look at the subunit of each bone, there are areas in which blood vessels and nerves can travel through the bone. And that's important, obviously, because why would bones need to have blood vessels throughout? What do the blood vessels provide? Nutrients, right? Glucose and oxygen. So bone cells need to live too. So in order for bone cells to live, they need to get adequate oxygen and nutrients and other contents that may be needed. All right. So the matrix of bone. Just a little bit about what makes up the matrix. The matrix of bone tissue or osseous tissue. Keep that in mind too. Sometimes osseous and bone tissue are used interchangeably. So osseous tissue is bone tissue. So you need to know that the matrix is about a third organic and 2/3 inorganic. So what does that mean to you? So our bones are about 1/3 organic. Right. So, right. So if it's organic, the part that's organic is made up of calcium and hydrogen. What are the organic molecules of life? What else? Lipids. Protein. Nucleic acid. Carbohydrates. Those are the organic molecules. So when you look here, you should recognize these. Collagen. What is collagen? They're fibers. So what type of fibers? Out of those 4 molecules of life we just talked about. Collagen is a protein. Okay? So the fibers are proteins that you learned about in the matrix of connective tissues. So collagen, so just so you know that bone matrix is made up of collagen and carbohydrates, protein complexes such as proteoglycans. So when you see a term like proteoglycan and glycoprotein, that should in a way tell you what that molecule is made up of. So proteo means protein. Glycan, G-L-Y-C, refers to carbohydrate. So a proteoglycan would be a carbohydrate that has a protein component to it. And glycoprotein would be a protein that has a carbohydrate component to it. So they're kind of the same. They're both made up of both protein and carbohydrates. So that's the organic component, which again is 1/3 of the matrix. And the majority of the bone matrix is inorganic. So when we talk about calcium phosphate, is calcium and phosphate organic? No, because they don't have what? Carbon. Okay? Well, this calcium phosphate has hydrogen, but it doesn't have carbon. And then you have calcium carbonate, which doesn't have hydrogen. So they would be inorganic matter. Primarily, you have calcium, which is the main mineral. And so calcium phosphate, another word for it is hydroxyapatite. So be familiar with that term. Hydroxyapatite is another name for calcium phosphate. And again, that makes up 85% of the inorganic part of the matrix. Other minerals that are part of the matrix of bone are fluoride, sodium, potassium, and magnesium. So additional minerals there. All right, so just a little bit to give you an idea of the difference between the inorganic component and organic component. Again, the organic component makes up about 1/3 of the bone matrix, whereas the calcium phosphate, being the inorganic part, makes up 2/3. So the combination is important because the structures kind of lend a different role to maintaining bone. So you have sort of a ceramic component and a polymer component. So the two combine optimal mechanical properties and allow bones to be able to be flexible, but also rigid and tough, so they're not easy to break. Okay, so the bone combines the polymer and collagen with the ceramic component, which is the hydroxyapatite. So what does the ceramic portion do for it? So the ceramic portion allows the bone to support the body's weight. Okay? And the protein portion gives bone some degree of flexibility. So you wouldn't expect collagen, being a protein, to be able to support our weight. So the tough ceramic portion, which is the inorganic part of bone, provides support. But we also need that protein component because it gives the bone flexibility. For example, so with rickets, here's a couple of examples. You've heard of rickets. Rickets causes bones to become very soft, and that's because they lose that ceramic portion. When they start to lose the calcium, the part that makes the bone hard, that the bones start to deform, and they can cause the bones to kind of bend, sort of, too much, to a degree. And then you have osteogenesis imperfecta, which is also called brittle bone disease, and this one involves a lack of protein. So if you don't have enough protein in your bone, that can cause the bones to become too brittle and easily broken. So structurally, so we're now looking at specifically the structure of long bones. So what do we mean when we say long bones? We'll get to the bone shapes in a second, but you all did just take a test. So you know the bones, right? So what am I holding here? The femur. So this bone here is the femur, and this one, the tibia and fibula. Very good. And what are these? Metatarsal, phalanges, tarsals. Good. So the bones that we call long bones here, so the femur would definitely be a long bone, and both the tibia and fibula, and even the metatarsals would be long bones. So the long bones are basically just bones that are long and thin. Longer, they have more length than they have width. So all long bones are going to have this structure that we see up here. So when you look at a long bone, you have an idea what's on the inside of that bone. So this bone on the screen here is what? It's the femur. Yeah, and that's something you all need to start working on. That test is next week. So you have to be able to identify the bones at the bone part. So you'll be able to recognize the bone because you know there's only one bone that has head. That's it. Okay, so you know just by looking at bones that it is the femur. All right, so structurally, you need to know all of those parts or structures that make up our long bones. So if you describe a long bone, you would say that it is long. It has a long shaft, right? So the center here is called the shaft of the bone. It's also referred to as the diaphysis. And the two ends of the bone, epiphyses, right? So you have the epiphyses on the ends of the long bone. And the center part of the long bone is the diaphysis, also called the shaft. So what do you have on the surface? Notice on the surface of the bones, wherever the bones are going to form a joint with another bone, there is something called articular cartilage. So articular, what does articular refer to? Is that a familiar word to you? Articulate, articulation. That just means that there's going to be some sort of a joint or connection with something else. So whenever there's wherever there's a bone that's going to articulate with another bone, and here, so this is the femur. So the head of the femur is going to articulate with this bone, pelvis, right? So it's going to articulate there. So whenever you have an articulation, you want something to cover the bone, some cartilage to cover it. Why? Why do you think there's a need to have cartilage wherever there's going to be one bone meeting with another? So the bones won't rub against each other. That would be painful and that would damage the bone. Okay? So the cartilage is there because the cartilage kind of has a slippery surface so that if there is any connection, there's not going to be any breakdown of the bone itself.
No, they got a shot for it.
They have a what?
I know you take a shot for it. You got I forgot what it's called.
Because he doesn't have his cartilage wore down or something?
Yeah, man. It's like football.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so athletes do have a lot of issues with the cartilage. Not necessarily this part of the cartilage. So when we get to the knee joint, there's a lot of cartilage in there. And a lot of injuries occur, not only with the ACL, but also there's cartilage pads between the femur and the tibia. And it's easy for those bones to collide and break or tear the cartilage. And that cartilage has to be repaired. So you have the articular cartilage. So where do we find articular cartilage? At the ends of long bones. Okay. And so you have it on the head of the femur. Also, you have part of the femur that forms the joint with the tibia. All right, what else do you notice in there? So notice the two bones, it looks like there's space. It's kind of spongy bone. Okay, so it's labeled at the bottom here, but you have spongy bone at the ends of long bones. So there's the epiphyses. You're going to have spongy bone. And spongy bone is not soft like a sponge. It's called spongy because you can see holes in it, kind of like you see in a sponge. So, what is it that fills up that space in the spongy bone? Marrow, bone marrow. So in the spongy bone, you have bone marrow. On this side, you can't really see the bone marrow. Over here. All right. So red bone marrow there. Also, there's what's called an epiphyseal line, and the epiphyseal line is also going to be on in the epiphyses at the ends of long bones, and those are called the growth lines or the growth plate. So if you were pre-adolescent or adolescent, that lining would not be made of bone, it would be made of cartilage. So for children that are growing, still growing in height, their bones are still growing in length. And those bones continue to grow as long as their epiphyseal disc is made up of cartilage. We stop growing when that cartilage completely what? Turns into bone. Okay? That's called ossification. So the epiphyseal disc in teenagers is made up of cartilage, and after a while, that cartilage ossifies to become bone, and at that point, the bone no longer grows in length. Okay, so ossification converts the cartilage at the epiphyseal disc to bone, and that ends the lengthening process of that bone. All right. A couple more things here. So, compact bone. So, there's spongy bone and compact bone. So, most of the bone is going to be compact. Even wherever you have spongy bone, there's always going to be compact bone around it. Okay? So, most of the bone, the long bone, is made up of compact bone. So what is inside the shaft? So you have the shaft here. So we talked about everything having to do with the epiphyses. So now let's look at the diaphysis specifically. So the diaphysis is the central part of our long bones. So if you were able to look inside of the shaft of a bone, you would notice that there's a space in that. Okay, so a picture of the femur on the right, you can see the space in there, and that space has a name. You need to know that. So that is called the medullary cavity. Right here. So the medullary cavity, and that medullary cavity is also called marrow cavity. So the medullary cavity is also called the marrow cavity. And that space then is filled up with marrow, bone marrow. Okay, you'll see that in children, the marrow in the medullary cavity is red bone marrow. But in adults, it turns to yellow marrow, okay, which is more fatty, more of a fatty consistency. All right. I think that was about it. So the marrow cavity, bone marrow, periosteum versus endosteum. That's another thing. So the periosteum, that's just a membrane that covers the bone, covers the outside of the bone. And then you have the endosteum, which lines the marrow cavity. Okay, so the endosteum, there's another slide coming up, I believe. It'll show you that one in a little bit more detail. Yeah, so this one shows you the endosteum. So the endosteum is the membrane that lines the medullary cavity. The periosteum is outside. The membrane covering the outside of the compact bone. And notice the compact bone here, and then you have the sponge bone here. Notice that the blood vessels penetrate both the compact bone and also the spongy bone. So spongy bone versus compact bone. So again, spongy bone has the little spaces, and compact bone is the more dense, solid looking part of the bone. And again, bone marrow is red or yellow in the medullary cavity. And then the membranes of bone are periosteum and endosteum. So red marrow, children, and we're only talking about in the medullary cavity. In adults, we do have red marrow, but it's mostly in the spongy bone. Okay. So this one is showing you what flat bone looks like. So you have flat bones, and the flat bones are all going to have spongy bone in the center and compact bone on the outside. So it's almost like a spongy bone sandwich, with the spongy bone being inside and the compact bone being like the bread of the sandwich. And so spongy bone there, the trabecula are the little spicules of bone that make up the spongy bone. All right, so the periosteum. So what is that again? Peri means what? Around, right? Perimeter. So the periosteum is the outer layer. Has the outer layer, so it has actually two layers. It's on the outside of bone. The outer layer is the fibrous layer. The inner layer is osteogenic. So whenever you see genic, what does that mean to you? Sort of like Genesis, creation. So the osteogenic, or inner part of the periosteum, is going to be where you have the osteoblasts and osteoclasts, and also osteogenic cells. So that's where the cell growth occurs. Also within there you have nerve fibers, nutrient, blood vessels, and lymphatic vessels. Okay, and then the endosteum, again, that's the membrane that lines the inside of the medullary cavity. And it's also going to contain osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So again, what is it that osteoblasts do? Form bone, and osteoclasts break down bone. Good. All right. So this picture just is showing you the membrane there, the periosteum, and the perforating Sharpie fibers that you see connecting, sort of like glue, connecting the membrane to the bone. But then you also see the blood vessels traveling through the compact bone there. All right. And you can see the yellow marrow with more detail. This is just the shaft of any long bone. That's not showing you what actual bone it is. Okay, a few things about bone marrow. Bone marrow is the term for the soft tissue that occupies the marrow cavity. And you all have seen bone marrow, right? You break a chicken bone, that stuff on the inside. Yeah. That is where red blood cells are actually made. In youth, that is. So it occupies the marrow cavity of long bones, and bone marrow also occupies the spaces among the trabecula, the spongy bone. All right, so red bone marrow is found in nearly every bone in a child. So that's going to be the medullary cavity and the long bone, and also amid the spongy bone. Hemopoietic tissues, we'll talk about this in 202 when we get to the blood chapters. But hemopoietic tissues are tissues that have the job of producing blood cells, or red blood cells, for example. So that is what red bone marrow is, a hemopoietic tissue, because it produces our blood cells. In adults, red bone marrow is found where? In the skull, the vertebrae, ribs, sternum. So notice all of those, or none of those, are long bones. But wherever you have long bones, notice the proximal head of the humerus and femur. So the humerus and femur are long bones, but you don't have red marrow in the medullary cavity of those bones. You only have red marrow in adults in the heads. And it says proximal head. What do you think that means? Proximal. Proximal heads of the humerus and femur. So the same as femur. Let's look at the femur. So it says the proximal head of the femur. So it's right here, right? Why is it called proximal? It's close to the point of attachment. So in the humerus, you will be proximal head of the humerus. Now we have one over here. So here's the humerus. So the proximal head of the humerus is here. So in adults, that's where we have red bone marrow. Only in those two parts of long bones. And then also in the skull, vertebrae, rib, sternum, and sternum, and parts of the pelvic girdle. All right, yellow marrow found in adults. So the other areas, as we said before, the medullary cavity or marrow cavity of our long bones, once we're adults, that becomes yellow marrow. And it no longer produces blood cells. All right. So, let's skip along through here. So the microscopic anatomy of bone, specifically compact bone. So for this part, you need to know the structure of the primary unit of our compact bone, and that's referred to as an osteon or Haversian system. So the main structural unit that makes up our compact bone is called an osteon or Haversian system. So let's look at the structures here. The compact bone is made up of subunits called osteons. So this is the part where I ask you to know the structure of an osteon, probably. So the parts that make up the osteon. So one of the main things you'll notice is if you look at compact bone, you look at this picture at the top, you'll notice that at the very end that you see circles there. So you see where there are blood vessels, the yellow, blue, and red on the end. So at the very end, notice the part that protrudes. In the center, you see the blood vessels and the nerves. So the blood vessels are blue and red, and the nerves are yellow. So all of that in the center there, where the blood vessels are, that is the central canal of an osteon. So notice how many central canals you see on that bone. How many are there? Counting this one too. So you should see six. You should see 6 central canals. So those six central canals are connected to, or they make up the central part of each osteon. So therefore you see 6 osteons there. You do see a partial one, a few partial ones as well, but they're not complete. So the osteon itself, you could say, starting out, since we mentioned that one first, that all osteons have a central canal, which contains what? Blood vessels and nerves. Okay, so that's one key point. So what else do you notice? So just on the one that's protruding, you also have concentric rings that make up each osteon. So those concentric rings are called the lamella. Lamella are the concentric rings of bone that make up the osteon. Okay, so that's the lamella. You can see it better on the picture at the bottom. And notice between each lamella, you have, actually it's little spaces, which are called lacuna. So notice that the picture at the bottom, so that you can see it more clearly. You have the concentric rings of bone called the lamella, and between each ring, you have small spaces which are called lacuna, and the lacuna are the spaces where the bone cells actually live. So the osteocytes reside in the lacuna, the spaces amid the lamella. Okay, so you see the osteocytes, again, those are the bone cells within the lacuna. So those are the components that make up osteon. So one more time, so osteons are units of compact bone. They're made up of concentric rings called concentric rings of bone called lamella. Between the lamella, between the rings, you have that's in the very center. But between each ring, between each lamella, you have the spaces called lacunae. And the lacuna is filled with osteocytes. So osteocytes reside in the lacuna. Also in the very center of all of the osteons, you have the central canal, which is filled with nerves and blood vessels. That's it. Alright. So that's just an up close view. So this one allows you to actually see the osteocytes, the cells in the nucleus within the cells. Oh, and also notice on this one, there's also a term called canaliculus. Forgot about those. Those are important too. So if you look at this picture, notice, let's see, right here where the line is actually passing through three. If you look at the word central canal, the line that goes across is going across three cells there. So three lacuna spaces that are filled with cells, osteocytes. But notice wherever the lacuna are, there's also going to be lines that are connecting one lacuna to another. Okay, so it doesn't look that clear, but that allows, and that's important because it allows the nutrients to make it from the central canal. So keep in mind these blood vessels are transporting what? Oxygen and glucose to all three of these cells. How is it going to get there? Through the canaliculi. So the nutrients themselves can't penetrate the bone, right? It's solid. So in order for all of the cells on the perimeter of the bone, in the outermost lamella, to actually get the nutrients, those nutrients have to pass through the canaliculi. Okay? So that is why those are important. So there is hormonal regulation of bone growth. So the main hormone that causes or stimulates growth of our bones and other tissues for that matter is called growth hormone. So growth hormone stimulates the epiphyseal plate. Remember what we said about the epiphyseal plate? What do we say? So where is the epiphyseal plate? Where do we find those? At the ends of long bones, right? And remember we said sometimes they're made of cartilage. In what cases would the epiphyseal plate be made of cartilage? In children and adolescents. So people who are still growing in height, their bones are still lengthening. So their epiphyseal plate would be made of cartilage. In adults, it's made of solid bone. Some growth hormone stimulates the epiphyseal plate during growth spurts. So when children hit those growth spurts, it's because growth hormone is stimulating the reproduction of the cells in that area. And then you have the thyroid hormone, which modulates activity of growth hormone. And then testosterone and estrogen at puberty help to promote growth spurts as well as end growth by inducing the closing of that epiphyseal plate. And that's also called ossification. So don't forget that term, ossification. Conversion of cartilage tissue or any other type of tissue to bone. Bone deposition occurs wherever bones are injured or added strength is needed. So the more stress you put on bones when you're young, the more bones grow, the more they thicken. That doesn't mean in length, but they thicken. And this is one reason why it's important to exercise while we're young, because as we get older, our bones break down faster than they build up. So throughout life, we're constantly losing old bone and making new bones, sort of like skin. So we're constantly losing old skin and gaining new skin. So since that's happening, we want to build the bone while we can build it faster than it's breaking down. As we get older, what happens to older people, they develop issues because their bones start to break down faster than it's building up, and their bones become too thin. Okay? What is that called? Osteoporosis. So in older, especially women, they tend to have osteoporosis more. So keep this part in mind. As we exercise, we're putting some stress on the bone. So while we're young, that stimulates bone deposits or growth of bone that will take a lot longer to lose as we get older. All right, so it requires a diet rich in protein. So diet is also important in bone growth. Exercise alone won't do it. You also have to have a diet rich in protein and also vitamin C, D, and A. And also calcium, phosphorus, manganese, and magnesium. So those are some of the components that are needed within the bone matrix. So we have to help the body out in that way by providing the bones with that material. All right, so bone resorption. Again, resorption means bone resorption, breakdown, right? So which cells have that job? That would be osteoclasts. So this explains how osteoclasts break down bone. Osteoclasts secrete an enzyme, a lysosomal enzyme, that has the ability to digest organic matter. Okay? And they break down the organic component of bone, and then acids convert the calcium salts into soluble form. And the dissolved matrix is transcytosed, I should say. So if you remember endocytosis and exocytosis, just imagine a cell, something coming into the cell by endocytosis, and then exiting the other side of the cell by exocytosis. That's all we're talking about here. Transcytosis. So the dissolved matrix is transcytosed across osteoclast to enter the interstitial fluid and then the blood. So here's the key, and this goes back a little bit to knowing how calcium homeostasis is maintained. So whenever osteoclasts break down bone, calcium leaves the bone and goes into the blood by this process. Okay, so bone resorption involves the breakdown of the bone, the release of calcium from the bone, and the calcium entering the blood by this process. So the hormonal control of blood calcium. So just like blood glucose must be maintained, blood calcium must be maintained. So if there's too much calcium in the blood, that can cause severe problems. If there's too little, it can also cause severe problems, even death. So there has to be that some mechanism, homeostasis mechanism, to make sure that whenever blood calcium goes too high or too low, that there's a way to bring it back to normal levels. All right, so calcium is necessary for all of these functions. So that's why we can't let calcium levels drop in the blood. Transmission of nerve impulses, so our nervous system needs calcium. Muscles can't contract without calcium. Blood coagulation requires calcium. And cell division and secretions by certain glands and nerve cells require calcium. So again, if calcium levels drop too low, it can be fatal. All right, so which hormones are responsible for maintaining blood calcium? That's what we're going to on the next two slides here. So PTH. So PTH is parathyroid hormone. So notice up here, parathyroid hormone, it's a hormone, and it's secreted by an endocrine gland. Remember what endocrine glands are? What are they? So those are the glands that secrete directly into the bloodstream. They secrete, the secretions are called hormones. So the endocrine glands secrete hormones, okay? And those hormones are secreted directly into the bloodstream. All right, so this is what this is showing you is what happens. So what if a person's blood calcium drops? So even though things are maintained, there are instances that cause the calcium levels to fall or increase. So if it does decrease, this process allows the blood calcium levels to return to normal. So first, the decrease in blood calcium levels stimulates the parathyroid glands to release parathyroid hormone. And that parathyroid hormone goes where? Where do all hormones go? Into the bloodstream, circulates to the bone. So the PTH enters the bloodstream, goes to the bone, and it tells the bone cells to do what? Specifically, it tells the osteoclast to do their job, which is to what? Break down bone. So when the bone breaks down, that releases what? Calcium from the bone. And where does that calcium go? It leaves the matrix of bone and goes into the blood. Okay? Huh? In what way? I can't see it that way. I mean, you may be onto something, but I So this is similar to what happens when your body temperature drops. Your body temperature drops, then what happens? The nervous system is involved there. Here, the endocrine system is doing the work. So the blood calcium falls. That causes the parathyroid gland. This is actually the answer to that question that you asked about. So what was the question? Calcium homeostasis. So really all you're answering is, how does the body control blood calcium levels? So you would just say, when blood calcium levels fall, that stimulates the parathyroid gland to secrete PTH. PTH tells, you can skip the blood part, the PTH tells the osteoclast to break down bone faster. Why? To release the calcium from the bone so it can go where? Into the bloodstream. So if you're sending calcium into the bloodstream, what is that doing to blood calcium? It's raising blood calcium levels. Okay? Isn't that easy? Yes. Okay? So PTH, parathyroid gland secrete PTH. PTH instructs the osteoclast to break down bone. Breaking down bone releases calcium. Calcium leaves the blood. Calcium leaves the bone matrix and enters the blood, thereby increasing blood calcium levels. Okay? What if the opposite happens? So if blood calcium levels increase, how does the body respond to that? Basically, you just have another gland and another hormone. So you don't have to remember parafollicular cells. Just remember the gland. So the thyroid gland will increase blood calcium levels. And there's a word for that, by the way. Low blood calcium versus high blood calcium. Low blood calcium is called hypocalcemia. High blood calcium, hypercalcemia. Okay? So one way you can say this here is under conditions of what? This one. Under conditions of hypercalcemia, the thyroid glands are stimulated to secrete calcitonin. Okay? The hormone calcitonin. Calcitonin is released into the blood and then goes to the bone to tell, not osteoclast this time, but osteoblasts to do their job, which is what? Bone formation. Okay? So in order to, when you form bone, you need calcium. So what that does is pulls calcium out of the blood and adds it to bone. Okay? So when you take the calcium out of the blood, send it to bone, it's no longer in the blood, so blood calcium levels decrease. Okay? So those two slides answer the question. Alright? I think y'all can handle that. Alright, so moving on. Mechanical stress. Yeah, so that's actually good. So responses to, this is the last slide on the chapter 7 part. So Wolff's Law, a bone grows or remodels in response to forces or demands placed upon it. Observations supporting Wolff's Law, handedness, left-handedness or right-handedness are the results in bone of one upper limb being thicker and stronger. So those are just some examples there. Curved bones are thickest wherever they are most likely to buckle. So that stress, again, as we said, this causes the buildup of bone. Okay. So nothing major on that part.